Hello Sushma, very happy to meet you here at the British Museum. The date today is the 10th of March 2020. Congratulations on becoming the first person of Indian origin to take permanent curatorial role at the museum. Tell us a bit about yourself, where were you born and your early life?
Thank you. I was born in Leicester, like a lot of other Gujaratis in the UK, and it was, I'll be honest, really boring standard upbringing. It wasn't, this amazing sort of thing. It was just, going to school, being encouraged in my education. I think the one really helpful thing for me was that my parents didn't actually encourage me to do a very traditional career. I think everyone Gujarati knows exactly what I'm talking about, doctor, lawyer, accountant, pharmacist. Instead, it was generally and genuinely left open to me to do what I wanted to do. And so a lot of my other, school friends, they did pursue those traditional paths, but it really wasn't for me. I did a bit of volunteer work in a hospital thinking, medicine looks quite interesting. And after being sort of observing a surgery, I thought, you know what, this is really not for me. So I went back to the drawing board. And I can honestly say I pursued my absolute passion, which is history and objects. I didn't ever know anyone who'd worked in this field, either history or museums or anything like that. It was only when I was at university I thought, well, I'm going to try something, and I just did a little bit of volunteer work during the Christmas holiday in Jewry War Museum in Leicester, and I just loved it. I think I just thought this is what I really want to be doing with my life. I'm not sure in what capacity, but I just finally felt really content and happy just working with collections in a museum environment. And so when I got back to university after the Christmas holidays, I sort of just, usual studies and stuff, and then did do some more volunteer work at the British Museum when I started my doctorate.
So, why history? Something must have inspired you, some incident in your life, or it was just something because of your work experience, which...
This is a rubbish answer, but I genuinely can't think of anything. It's just something I've always honestly been interested in. I mean, my mum was brilliant. She always took us to museums. They're easy to get to, they're free. And the Jewry War Museum was amazing. The New Walk Museum in Leicester was amazing. And I genuinely enjoyed it. The fact that these objects actually survived from the past, sometimes for thousands of years, I still find it mind-boggling. And even now, when I handle an object that is really ancient, I just think it's the best thing in the world, and try to learn a bit more about what happened in that past, but also how that object came to be where it is today. I think for me that's really important to uncover.
Your background is Gujarati, your parents, they come from Gujarat, or they come from Africa, or...?
They're both from East Africa.
Okay.
So my mum was born in Nairobi, my dad was born in Uganda. But my family on my mum's side had quite a long history in East Africa in particular. So my nanny ma was born in Tanzania, and I think her father was also born in Tanzania. So they've had a long history there. But my Nana Baba, he was born in Burma, and then he made his way over to East Africa. So it's sort of, India, Burma and East Africa.
Yes.
And do you think the family history was somehow related to your interest in history?
You know what, honestly, it's not something we ever talked about very much when we were younger. It was just not, we didn't ignore it, but it was just, every single Gujarati family that we knew, including our whole family, they all had the same story. So I suppose it wasn't something that we needed to talk about, or rather they needed to talk about. And it was only when we all got slightly older and we realised actually these are incredible stories, we really need to record them. And my mum just started to actually make small videos of my nanny ma talking about her early life in East Africa, things like that. So I think totally took it for granted growing up,
Yes.
but now that I'm an adult, I'm now very interested.
Yeah. Sometimes we don't credit our grandparents' stories, and you'll never find those stories in any textbook or anywhere, would you?
No,
So it's kind of such a precious bit of history that we all must really treasure them, isn't it?
Yeah, and also before it's too late, unfortunately
Yes.
all of our grandparents are getting older and
Yeah.
those stories are often disappearing because we haven't asked them the right questions.
So let's come back to your present role. How did you get into this very prestigious role, and were there any obstacles in the way, or tell us a bit about how you came to British Museum?
Well, I mentioned that I volunteered here for a while, and that was in the Department of Coins and Medals. I'd never worked with coins before; it was totally new to me. But it was a really fantastic department, and I got to do some really interesting work on a project with Dr. Elizabeth Errington, who's been amazing actually, and really helped train me up and try and figure out what on earth I was doing with my life. So I really made the most of it and rediscovered a collection, which was very exciting, and I was encouraged to publish, which I did. And that led to me applying for a temporary contract. I've had about 6 years of temporary contract, like so many other people. It's really hard, the wages are really low, and I think unless you have a real passion for what you're doing, it's just not something you're ever going to pursue. For me, I really love what I do, and the wages are low, but take a deep breath and deal with those. And so I got to work on a big storage move project of all the Asia ethnographic collections as a curator involved in that project. And that led to another project, and then ended up working on the Houghton Gallery refurbishment, which was incredible. The first time I've ever worked on any kind of gallery work like that. And it was also a lot of responsibility, but I think with hindsight, it was obviously very stressful and very hard. But knowing that people are going to be able to see that for the next 10, 20 years is really incredible. But I'm very keen that it doesn't just stayed, it doesn't just stay like that. And we are working on a series of interventions in the gallery to bring in South Asian diaspora communities to co-curate sections with us. And by co-curate, I don't mean me saying, so this is exactly what I want done, will you help me do it? It's a genuine partnership, and it's a genuine discussion about what we do and how we do it. So,
Can you describe this process a bit, this co-curating, community co-curating? How does it work? Is it, as you said, is it not just a little gimmick, to get people in the museum, or is it real?
I think in some places it is a gimmick, and I think unfortunately it has got quite a bad reputation because of that. For me, I get to work with colleagues in our Learning and National Partnerships department, and they have real expertise in how to really work with people in a way that benefits both of us. And working together, I think we are developing a way to do it. And the project that I mentioned, it's the first time that we've really worked in this kind of partnership on a permanent gallery project that we hope is sustained in the long term. I don't want just one rotation of a small display. I would like us to work together for the next few years to see where that leads us. And also it's not just about putting a few things on display, adding a couple of new labels and maybe a picture if we're feeling really excited. It's also about looking at our collections. How do we collect the contemporary diaspora experience in collaboration with members of the diaspora? These are all conversations that are ongoing. I honestly don't know what this display is going to look like. I don't know what kind of collections we're going to acquire. But I think actually that's what I'm most excited about. I really want to see where this project leads us. We're hoping to have the first display installed in about December time of this year, in 2020. And yeah, let's see what happens after that.
But how do you get the people who you work with? How is the procedure? How did you communicate with them?
Twitter is a very, very helpful resource these days, and there are some incredible Punjabi and Sikh heritage organisations in the UK, and they've been extremely generous with their time, knowledge, and sharing lists of people who are interested and sharing what the project that we are working on with their wider communities. And it's through that people have decided, yeah, actually I'm quite interested, or decided, well, it's not really for me, but maybe in the future. That's fine. You know, this is voluntary. I don't want people coming if they're not really interested. So yeah, I'm really enjoying it. It's the first time I've done quite this kind of work, so I have to say I'm definitely learning as we're going along as well.
There's the makeup of ethnic minority professionals in this heritage sector is very low. It's just about 7% or something I read somewhere. And does it surprise you?
It does and it doesn't. I think most of the sort of the BAME museum workforce is still, unfortunately, at entry-level jobs. And most entry-level jobs in the sector, they increasingly are temporary. So we've got a situation where people are trying to break into the sector, having a series of temporary contracts, which are generally very poorly paid, and then completely understandably deciding to leave. I completely understand that. And I think actually it's the sector as a whole that needs to change its approach to its workforce to help change that. Because, you know, saying that you want a more diverse workforce, well, what on earth does that mean? And also, what exactly are the more senior members of staff doing to make any of that happen? If they are making a few more, you know, internships available, then frankly it's just not enough. I would very much like to see more senior members of staff from minority groups. I still haven't seen very many directors, and the directors I've seen, they don't tend to stay in post very long, which I find really quite worrying. And the ones that I have seen, they haven't yet talked about why they left so soon. And I wonder, you know, how much support or not are they getting in that role? And I honestly, I don't know what the solution to this problem is. It seems enormous.
Do you consider yourself as a change maker now that you've got this job, and you would have hopefully some power to change the perspective of people to come into this sector?
It's nice that you think I have any power. I'm not sure I have any. But I try and do as much of the outreach work as I can. And also, if people get in touch, I'm very happy to answer questions, help and support in any way that I can. What I can't do is create jobs. I wish I could, but I'm afraid I can't. When I'm on a hiring committee, I'm very keen that those adverts reach as wide an audience as possible. And I'm also very interested in how we pick who we pick. And I think that's something that more people need to be aware of, whether it's, you know, application forms that come to us without any names on at all, or maybe we need to start looking more carefully about, you know, how many of these qualifications that we are requesting, how necessary are they? Can, you know, lived experience, can actual experience, work experience count instead or as well as? Once again, I don't have one clear answer for you, and I really wish I did, but I think these are all things that we do need to start thinking about more carefully. If we really want to see this kind of change continue and not just end with, you know, one or two people reaching a certain level. Exactly, absolutely.
Do you think it makes a difference if members of ethnic minorities are part of the staff?
Of course it does. I mean,
give some examples.
Yeah, I mean, it's so easy to say, oh, it makes no difference. You don't need to see, you know, brown or whatever faces in the workforce. But the reality is that it does make a difference. If you want people to aspire to a career in the arts, it really helps to see people who have in some way made a difference, made a success of a particular career, so that, you know, younger people or people at university are thinking, maybe this is a viable thing for me. And also, I can tell my parents that actually, look, these other people have done okay, maybe it's something I can pursue. Maybe I don't need to take a very traditional path.
Tell us a bit about your research on your PhD and whatever you have been doing so far.
Wow, where do I start? So I did my doctorate at UCL, which I really enjoyed. It was a sort of a 3-part PhD. I was broadly interested in how a particular historical moment was transformed during the colonial period by both British and Indian scholars. And that moment was when Chandragupta met Seleucus. So this is just after Alexander the Great had left Punjab. He sort of made a very bloody incursions there in about 326 BC. And about 20 or so years later, one of his successors, Seleucus, made his way east, and Chandragupta had overthrown the Nanda dynasty in northern India and made his way west. And they met by the banks of the Indus. We have hardly any information that's come down to us about this moment. They had some kind of peace treaty. There are sort of 3 parts of this treaty that have come down to us. But what's most interesting is that it's not at all clear who might have won this battle that they apparently fought with each other. And so you've got the British scholars and the Indian scholars, especially around the time of, during the colonial period and around the time of Indian independence, each having a very different take on what happened. You've got the Europeans essentially saying, oh no, it was Seleucus, he absolutely won this battle and he came out incredibly well in this peace treaty. Whereas the Indians take a very different approach. For them, Chandragupta won this battle. He was a glorious ruler who overthrew these, European incursions into India, and he absolutely came out better in this peace treaty. But the most important fact is we have no idea what happened. So it tells us a great deal about how they look at history, how history is created. And I'm also very interested in how that history manifests itself now. So when you look at popular culture in South Asia broadly, but also including among the diaspora in the UK. And you have these historical novels about Chandragupta or even Ashoka or the Mauryans or other Indian rulers. You have Chandragupta, the TV series. You have Chandragupta, the movies. The Indian version has won out. The Indian interpretation of history has won out. So the one that we all watch as kids, that our children are watching, that we are all, engaging in, it's all shaping our worldviews. And very few people are aware that it rests on very, very shaky ground. So it's that sort of dynamic, that sort of transformation of history and its expression today in popular culture is what really I find very interesting.
You talked about your interest in objects in museums, and how do you draw out stories from objects, and how do you approach object collection?
I think it depends what you want to do. If it's for a gallery project, is it for an exhibition, is it for a research paper, is it for a talk? It really depends. I look after quite a large collection, and so for me it depends what I want to say and what I happen to see in the stores or on display, and decide what do I want to pick out here.
Would you like to show stronger links between historic objects and the Indian diaspora and the UK? Because I know you've done some work with the Jain sculptures and was it the religious traditions in India? Was that something which triggered your work with this object collection?
I think traditionally curators have had quite a connoisseur's approach. It was traditionally about appreciating an object for its maybe its artistic value, its beauty, its value. Whereas I'm an ancient historian, I'm much more interested in the wider stories connected with any object or any collection. I would like to know a lot more about when and where it was found, how it made its way here to this museum or any museum. I'm very interested in trying to understand a bit more about the past through that object. And very much, why is it still important? Is it important to diaspora communities? If not, why not? If it is, then once again, why? Why? What sort of collections are there that people have no interest whatsoever in? So for me, it's sort of the collecting history aspect as well as the wider sort of historical story that you can tell with it. I've got, I have a PhD student, for example, and I got funding with a colleague at Brighton University for this project. And it's about looking at the South Asian collectors represented at the British Museum widely, not just among the South Asia collections, but what about the Chinese porcelain some of them may have donated? What about some coins? What about all these other objects? And the project is ongoing and the student is in the second year at the moment. And I'm fascinated to know what that story actually is, because we all have our prejudices and our stereotypes in our mind. The assumption is that a South Asian person could only possibly be interested in South Asian objects and donate those South Asian material to the museum. It's simply not true. And another project we've got funding for with a colleague at the University of Lincoln is looking at the South Asian collections broadly defined and looking at the women collectors represented there, because once again, women tend to be very much sidelined. Traditionally, it's a male colonial collector, and that person maybe forms the hub of an entire research project. I'm very interested in changing that, and I'm hoping that through these projects, through the publications, the talks, and looking at a collection in a very different way, we will actually look beyond that stereotype and realise that actually the bulk of our collections are made up of, dare I say it, everybody else. And what does that mean for our collections? So my interest is not just from a purely aesthetic point of view. I'm very interested in the circumstances around the collecting and what that really means for the museum.
Do you think it can also be difficult because there's a big discussion about, we're sitting here at the British Museum,
Yeah.
which of course is a world museum, and there's so many objects, and we know about the origin of the museum.
Absolutely.
Is it not, are you not questioning your own institution?
How could I not be? But through these projects, that's exactly what I'm doing, and I'm sharing that work with my colleagues as well, who are also very interested in this. And I think if you're not troubled in any way by any of the research you're doing, then I think you're doing something quite wrong. And you know, I think unless you are genuinely open and honest about what you have, how can your research have the capacity to make change? Every institution and every person needs to change in their lives. And I think this is one aspect of it that will hopefully help that.
Is there a role for intangible heritage?
Of course there is, absolutely. And I think that's where the database comes in very handy, but also public programming. We're very fortunate. We've got, like most museums in the world, we have a great database, and it's it's the most incredible storehouse of knowledge. Some of it makes its way into labels, but through visitor research we've been doing, actually most visitors do not read labels, so we need to find other ways of sharing this information. With a colleague, for example, we set up a series of collecting history gallery talks across the museum, not just the South Asia galleries, but genuinely across the museum. So other colleagues, students that we have, and even external members of staff from other institutions or freelancers come in and actually talk about the history of collections and share it with members of the public. It's free. It's for anybody who wants to come over and listen, and you can tell much richer stories in that way. And once again, when you have events, whether it's a lecture, whether it's a dance performance, once again you're sharing knowledge about the institution, the collections, particular objects and entire cultures in a very different way. Because when, as we both know, when you go to a Mandir temple, all of the sculptures are surrounded by music, sound, colour, dance, life. They're so alive. When they are in museums, it's slightly different. So how do we tell our story to the over 75% of people who come from outside the UK to visit the museum? Many of them actually don't know anything about the history of India or South Asia broadly, and what they do know is probably based just in what they read on the news, which, let's be honest, is not particularly positive, and it doesn't really delve into the rich religious culture, the music, the sounds, the dance. And so it's a very partial view they might have. So how do we share that? How do we give them a richer experience of the incredible cultures of this incredible region?
Yeah, the question, how did you show this in the exhibition? How did you translate this idea in the exhibition? Well,
for me, talking about the gallery in particular, simply because that's one I did work on, it was not just a traditional gallery project for me. For me, I was very interested in what do we do next. Once it's all done, everything's installed, the labels are there, we've taken a deep breath, then what? And that's where I think it's important to engage with other people and do it genuinely, collaboratively, which we are actually doing. And it's not going to stop at just, one or two object changes or the occasional label change. It's about programming as well. It's about working with members of the community to deliver other gallery talks for people. It's about maybe musical events. It's about different dance events and also maybe more academic lectures as well. A whole range of things that we are actually exploring together.
But don't you think it's also the way how objects are displayed has to change? A few days ago I was in the gallery and was looking at the South Asia gallery. It's very fixed everything, you know. So how did it come alive, you know? Is it just a system in the British Museum or?
I think it's all galleries. I mean, for us, it's an Edwardian gallery. You can't change the cases. We can't change the architecture of the space either. So we're very limited in terms of even the size of objects and what we can put into these cases. And I think that's why all of the other work is so important around that, the different events that you do. You know, we're never going to get permission to change or take out those cases. It's just not going to happen. And that's completely reasonable, I think. But I think we can do a lot more other interesting work that will push us beyond our comfort boundaries and try different things. And for me, it's so important to experiment. I do not have all these amazing, answers to the, how do we do this and how do we do that? But I'm very willing to try different things and seeing what works, which bits don't work, because those bits are normally particularly important. And then how do you try again? I don't want to just think, that might not work, or what will people think? I'm the opposite of that. I really want to embrace this idea of trying different things and changing based on trying those different things.
So you're the South Asia curator. Can you talk about your own gallery, South Asia?
Mm-hmm. So I'm one of two curators who works on South Asia. I do ancient to medieval material and also most of the ethnographic collections, which are the objects of everyday life. And my colleague does medieval to modern and the paintings and the photography within that. So it's quite a large collection. The gallery, it was very different from what came before. Before, it was very much a gallery of religions. And I say religions, but it's a very partial approach to the religions of South Asia. I think it was done in 1992. Obviously, I was not involved in that. I was still at school in the 90s. But it was sort of a walk in a very sort of art historical way through the religions of South Asia. It was looking at Jainism, looking at Hinduism, and it was looking at Buddhism primarily, both in South Asia but also partly in Southeast Asia. Our approach when we totally revisited the space was very different. We started with the Paleolithic, which is about 1.5 million years ago, and we brought the whole story right round through the present day. We looked at it as a sweep of history for people who, i.e. the bulk of our visitors, who are not familiar with the history and the cultures of South Asia. So it's sort of broadly chronothematic, it's chronological, but there are also sections where, you have a section on Mathura, for example, you have a section on the Deccan, or, things like that. So, when you go past, you see the beautiful, the white marble, you're probably in Rajasthan, or at least Western India. You see the beautiful, dark grey schist, you're in Gandhara up in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or you're in Odisha, in Eastern India. So it's trying to show people that, this is a place of the most incredible different cultures and styles and religious traditions, and they're all slightly different in these different areas. And look, this is how you can understand that. And another big decision we took was, previously the whole of the centre aisle of the gallery was completely covered in, well, not covered, it contained a lot of large sculpture. We decided to move the sculpture into the bays themselves to create a large performance space. So we knew from the very outset that we were very keen to bring in a very different kind of programming to the space and to make the space work for that in the future.
What I discovered is that it's also, I'm thinking about different community in India. So what I was missing was the display of the Adivasi and tribal community, like the Northeast doesn't exist. The central India, all the communities there, about 10% of the population of India. Was it intentional, or is it just still not enough space, or what's the reason?
Gosh, you'd have to talk to my colleague about that, for the simple reason that I didn't work on that section of the gallery at all. I did the ancient to medieval section, and within that, the one area I was adamant to get in, because I think from the very start I was very adamant that the diaspora experience had to be represented in this gallery in some way. And given the speed at which that particular gallery progressed, we didn't have a huge amount of time to really engage with that properly, not nearly as much as I wanted to do at the time. So one very small example was going to the Jain Centre in Leicester, taking some amazing images, and they were very, very generous with letting us in to do that, and adding those into the Jainism in Western India, the medieval Western India section, for example. But as I was doing that, I was very well aware that there were interventions that I want to make in the gallery in the future, and that's exactly what I'm doing now. So, when I said at the beginning that I don't see this gallery as just a gallery, once it's open, we're done, we can ignore it for 10 or 20 years. I think it's the starting point, and actually now I think that the very exciting work starts, and it has already started. And you won't see it in the gallery yet because we're planning to do the first rotation in December.
One of the legacies of the colonial rule was that Indians allowed a lot of their historic artifacts to be taken out of the country, and they are housed in places like V&A, British Museum. But and there's a perception amongst many people that a lot of them were looted. But there are some genuine cases where these museums acquired them legally. And can you name any such object, and how has the story of that object been told to the wider community?
I think it's incredibly important to look at the wider circumstances of how objects were collected, and that's a key part of my own research actually. So it's something I talk about in public lectures, in gallery talks. I have a podcast that's dedicated to the idea of decolonising museums, and it's called The Wonder House. And also another project that I'm working on, which is a really exciting one actually, is the Manchester Museum South Asia Gallery, which is in partnership with the British Museum. And it's I think for the first time, a gallery of South Asia, or rather at least the South Asian diaspora experience in the UK, but particularly Manchester, is being fully co-curated with members of the local community, the community collective. And it's incredibly exciting, I particularly love the fact that we do not agree on everything. I think so many of us exist in a kind of bubble where everyone essentially agrees with pretty much everything that everyone else is saying. And that's increasingly worrying me. If everyone agrees with me, I think there's something wrong. I think I don't want to be trapped in this bubble anymore. And it's really great that we have open, honest conversations about this. And we do. And that's what's so great. We are starting, traditional gallery project often starts with objects rather than the stories. This project is starting with the people at the very heart of this gallery, their stories, the stories that they want to tell. And we are there, essentially supporting them in developing them, thinking about objects, sharing different display ideas, whether it's, traditional object in a case, or whether it's a video, whether it's something interactive. And we absolutely talk about the fact that, for some objects, we genuinely have no idea exactly how they were acquired. This place has been open since, 1759 or something. That's a good 250 years. We can't know everything, but where we do know, where we can research, we absolutely should. And we should do that in collaboration, I think, as well, with colleagues, obviously both here, but also in South Asia, and that's something I very much do. And I think it's vital that we do that.
And do you find it easy to collaborate with colleagues back home in India, where you can share your skills, knowledge, expertise?
Yeah, I actually work with colleagues from Pakistan, India and Sri Lanka, and that's really important to me. We have, for example, an international training program here, so every year we normally have at least one person from, say, India, at least one person from Pakistan, and from last year we had our first delegate from Sri Lanka, and I'm hoping that next year we'll also have someone from Bangladesh, because we haven't had that before. So it's a great way to start building a network and actually genuinely working together. We go down into stores, we do talk about provenance, we do talk about what we have, why we have it, but we also talk about what do we do now? How do we work together? What kind of projects do we work on together? And I think that's really important, not just for the occasional meeting over coffee or something, but actually sustained collaboration. It's too easy to say, oh yes, I absolutely engage with my colleagues in whichever place you're talking about, and the reality of that collaboration is a Skype telephone call once or twice a year. What is the point almost? What exactly is anyone getting out of this? Whereas for me, I'm way more interested in, right, what we can do in the long term. How are we actually going to share skills, knowledge, resources, and what's the outcome going to be? And what is that outcome going to change? Because once again, how do we embed that change in the structure of an organisation or in the structure of a project in something that's not just superficial? And so as soon as somebody retires or leaves, it just falls away to nothing. So for me, increasingly, that's what I'm interested in.
Are you planning any projects with your colleagues?
I am. Yes, so I am working on a few things. I think the difficult thing is that I've started a few projects, but none of them are going to see the light of day until beginning at the end of this year and over the next 5 years. So when I talk about long-term sustained projects, I actually really mean it. I'm actually living that. I'm not about having a quick conversation, sticking something online and saying, hey, look at this amazing thing we did, and then moving on to the next bit. I'm actually interested in building these and long-term relationships. I'm currently working, for example, on an exhibition proposal, but the exhibition is not going to be on until 2025. But what an amazing opportunity to once again build some decent networks and actually interrogate the idea of collecting collections from South Asia in a really sort of meaningful way, not just a superficial, let's just have a quick label over here and we've tackled that. I want to change how we display objects in exhibitions like this, and I would like to do it in collaborations with my colleagues in South Asia, but also the diaspora here. And it's experimental. I don't have the answers for you yet, but hopefully in 5 years' time when the exhibition opens, there'll be a slightly different way to see and approach this kind of project.
Is it easy to work with institutions, for instance, in India, India Museum? Is it easy to cooperate with them and maybe exchanging objects and accessing objects?
I think the closer we build our relationships, the easier it becomes. And I'm sort of laughing because sometimes it has been quite challenging. But we've built the most incredible, strong relations with, for example, this CSMVS in Mumbai. We absolutely exchange objects. About a year or so ago, there was a great collaborative exhibition, and it was actually collaborative. It was called India in the World. And the British Museum, loaned objects from the rest of the world, whereas the CSMBS provided the objects from India and told the global story of India. It was really very interesting. And that did move to the National Museum in New Delhi, and then, obviously the objects all came back. The nice thing is that we've got new generations of professional curators, professional conservators in India and Sri Lanka and Pakistan and in Bangladesh. So this is all starting to happen, and it's really exciting. And the nice thing is that we can collaborate as professionals and exchange skills and knowledge as professionals when we do these kind of collaborative projects. It can still be quite tricky to access some collections in some institutions, but the nice thing is it's becoming a lot easier. Lots of museums are starting to digitise their collections and also to make them slightly more accessible to researchers. It works sometimes better than others, but I think it's on the right track. I think generally they're less worried about people coming in to look at material in order to actually research it. But it really depends. It's so. I think the tricky thing is it's so variable. Sometimes you go over and you've made plans in advance, you've been in touch, but the last minute you're told no, you can't see something, and it's incredibly frustrating because there's not normally a reason given for it. You're just told no, and this trip has cost you a small fortune, and you're totally stuck. But I think, in all honesty, a lot of museums are getting a lot better with it. And I think with new curators who are coming in, they are very interested in sharing knowledge more widely. They're very interested in publishing their collections and making international collaborations as well. So I think it is slowly changing, but it is quite slow.
But the other way around, you earlier said that also colleagues from India are coming to the British Museum. Do you make your collection available to them?
Absolutely. So one of the great things about the collection is that it is a public collection. We've digitised a huge proportion of the objects and they're on collection online, and the new iteration of that website is coming, I think, in about April time of 2020. And as we register objects, as we digitise them, they all go on that for everybody and anybody with an internet connection to access. We also have a system of study rooms in the museum, so you just Google British Museum study room and you basically fill out a form, mention which objects you want to see and make an appointment to come and see them. So for me, I'm so used to that approach where you basically sort of send an email and say, hey, can I come and see this, this and this? Is this particular appointment available? You're normally told, yeah, that's fine, or maybe another date, and off you go and you go and see it. So it's quite frustrating in the other way that you have no reason for being prevented from looking at material. See what I mean?
We had also a positive experience because we were asking for the Radwa objects, the horses, and we just got the okay, we can use it, but it's not processed yet. Do you know anything about these specific objects, because they're originally from Gujarat in the Baroda area?
So they were acquired by my predecessor, Richard Blurton, in I think the mid-1980s, when I wasn't even at primary school yet, so this was some time ago. From what I understand, and bear in mind I don't know this material particularly well, they were created by local Hindu craftsmen for the Adivasi community, and I think they were for ritual processes or ritual events. So you'll have horses, and sometimes with riders on the horses. Sometimes there'll be mandir or temples included as well. And they're sort of splashed with colour, normally white pigment. But in all honesty, I don't know a great deal more than that. I don't think they're fired in kilns. I think they're just charcoal fired, so they're very, very brittle. I remember during the my first actual job at the museum, we were moving these collections from one storage facility to another, and they were really tricky to handle, they were tricky to pack because, you know, they were so incredibly fragile, but things that were absolutely fascinating as well. But in the end, I decided to research some gandaos, which are sort of model funerary figurines made by the Kalash people in Chitral Valley in Pakistan. So I ended up researching those instead.
I was listening to your podcast the other day and I found some of the stories were quite interesting. How did that come about?
Do you mean the Wonder House?
Yes, the Wonder House.
Wow, so the first episode was released last year, in November actually, but it's something I've been wanting to do for a little while, but I was always a bit too nervous to try it because I've never done a podcast before. This is a very different way for me to work. But I was attending conferences, talking about the idea of decolonising in museums, talking to people over coffee, having some really interesting conversation. And I was very aware that the vast majority of people are not part of these conversations because, you know, they might not be able to attend a particular conference for financial reasons or whatever reasons they might have. And also the conversations over coffee, once again, they're quite private conversation. Not private in the sense that we didn't want anyone listening in, but simply because, you know, just meeting a friend or colleague over coffee and having a good chat about things. And for me, as I said, I really feel it's, you know, it's important that we're open and honest about our institutions, our collections, how we work, what our practice is. And I thought, well, how about we move those conversations from, you know, over coffee or at a conference to something that's completely available to anybody, anywhere in the world, for free. And I thought, well, I'm going to give this a go. And so I got in touch with my colleague called Nick Harris, who's a sound editor and producer. And I sort of pitched this idea to him, and thank God he said, yeah, sure, let's give it a go. And so we did it. And I really enjoyed it. I felt I was doing something important and that might actually help change the sector in some way. And it has been incredibly successful. We've had thousands and thousands of listeners, which, I'll be honest, I was expecting maybe 100 or 200 if I was lucky, because, you know, when it's a starter podcast, you don't normally get a very big audience. So I was gobsmacked by that. And on the back of it, I've decided to do season 2. So I have a list of people I will be interviewing. We've got the dates in the diary, and and I'm hoping that they will be recorded and released by June of this year, 2020. And I also have a Kickstarter campaign because it's a private podcast, so I've been funding it from my own salary. But we're hoping that other people will be interested and invested enough in the project to contribute, even if it's the price of a cup of coffee, you know, to listen in this. So I'm really excited about it because it's not about saying you're doing it wrong, you shouldn't do it like this, and, you know, dragging people down, which unfortunately people are all too happy to do, especially on social media, and it's just not how I work. I'm interested in encouraging people and saying, look, this is how some people have tried it. Why don't you have a go if you want to? But also in a way that works for you, the collections you work in or work with, the institution you work in. It's about empowering the individual. That is what I'm interested in. And I'm absolutely not about tearing anybody down, because I think if you've taken the time to experiment, then frankly, all power to you. Well done. Because I know it's not easy, especially with people circling and trying to, you know, find the flaws in what you're doing. Whereas the thing is, nothing that we do is going to be absolutely perfect. We can all improve on it. And I think this is how we do it, by sharing this kind of knowledge and these different kinds of approaches.
You have a wider mission. You're doing your private broadcast, and you were just talking about this vision through social networking and all this. Do you have a broader mission to change a certain thing?
I really am. I really want to see a genuinely representative museum sector. I'm sick of being the only brown person in, you know, most of the meetings or events that I attend. It's not sustainable. How can it stay like that? And I just find a lot of people are very good at talking the talk, and they are really not good at walking the walk. Because when you look at their own institutions, you think, well, what exactly are you changing? But more importantly, how are you embedding that change in your institution so it doesn't simply revert back to, you know, type when somebody retires. So I think that is increasingly what I'm trying to look at. Once again, I do not have a final date in mind or anything like that, but it's something that is infusing all the work that I do and what I talk about and how I do things as well. So I think it's a watch this space kind of scenario for me.
What about the audience, the broader audience, the non-museum people? Do you have a mission for them?
That's a tough one. It's hard enough trying to engage people in museums actually in the first place. I think through podcasts, but also through I mentioned the programming in the gallery. So we've already had a few dance events, we've already had some public speaking events, and it's been quite interesting because we have drawn a very different audience, or at least a slightly different audience. People who wouldn't necessarily come to a museum to come and look at collections, they are quite keen to come and think about, well, what can I experience in this space that's slightly different, that I would go otherwise to a concert or something about. And if they come in for that, how do we grab their attention and say, hey, but what about all this amazing stuff? So I am very interested in that. And I think, once again, the Manchester Gallery, I think, is going to be particularly interesting because within that gallery space, there's a performance space at its heart, just like the Houghton Gallery. So it's about working with members of the community to think about what do they do with that space? What kind of events do they want to put on? What kind of programming? And once again, I think that will draw different audiences to the gallery and to the museum in general. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with that.
Migration stories and documentation, do you get emotional about them since your family history? We are all migrants in this country.
You know what? When I was younger, I didn't at all. If I'm honest, I didn't really think about it. I think it's only since I've become a parent myself and thought about exactly what my grandparents went through bringing their very young family over to the UK, where they didn't know anybody at all. They had virtually no money. The oldest child was my mum, who was 10, and the youngest was, I think about 4 or 5 or something. And it just, I cannot imagine doing that. They came over, moved to Leicester, and they lived in 2 rooms of a terraced house. And my Nana Bapa worked sort of 80 odd hours a week as a bus conductor. That's the only job he could get. Nanny Ma was at home until she was able to get a job in a local factory, a knitwear factory, which obviously Leicester is very famous for. And somehow they managed to, get their kids educated and get them independent and live a decent life. And it's genuinely mind-boggling. I really don't know exactly how they did it. The amount of willpower that takes, but also how much family support that takes. I wonder how many of us are capable of doing that. I find that extremely emotional, actually. And when I sort of find myself complaining that, oh my God, I need some new shoes, but when you put that into perspective of, okay, we can't actually afford any new winter coats, and so what are we going to do now? Makes you, I don't know, gives you a bit of humility.
Sure, of course.
Would you like to say something a bit more general about this? I suppose not only your family, but many other families as well.
Yeah.
How do you see it from today's perspective, of course, not as a child?
I think a lot of us have forgotten, or rather we didn't even know. I mean, I was born in Leicester. I didn't have that kind of, I'm not going to say it was a really lovely, easy upbringing because, my parents struggled. It was, expensive. It took a long time to be able to have a house and things like that. The first house we lived in was a housing association house. It wasn't, some amazing mansion somewhere. And they worked incredibly hard. I wonder, how much do we take for granted, and are we even focusing on maybe what we should be focusing on? I don't know. I think we've become so materialistic, not just the Gujarati community, but actually so many communities, diaspora, the local communities, everybody. It's so, what do I have? What am I wearing? What kind of phone have I got? And I'm finding that as I get older, it's not quite as important to me. I genuinely want to go and spend time with my family and friends, and especially my daughter and my husband. And it means so much more to me than the other stuff, And I don't want to say that in a sort of really stupid, trite kind of way. Oh, the materialistic's not very important. Of course it is in a way. Of course it is. But we just seem to be spending so much of our time focusing on it. And I
think earlier when we were talking about how the Punjabis and Sikhs have tried to maintain their heritage, and I think that's lacking in the Gujarati community.
Unfortunately it is, yeah, unfortunately. And I genuinely don't know why. I've tried to reach out and sort of speak to people about it. But among the people I've spoken to, there just doesn't seem to be the interest in really collecting the stories, the incredible stories, which I said, they are slowly going. The older generations, unfortunately, they're getting very old now. And if we don't capture that information soon, it's sort of gone. And it's a sort of a unique community. I remember when I went back to Gujarat for the first time, it was really hard to talk to people in my Gujarati because it's actually quite different from their Gujarati. And, basic words, we were sort of looking at each other thinking, I think I should know what you're saying, but I have no idea. But also some of the objects that, families brought over from East Africa. Every single Gujarati family that I know has a small wooden sculpture of a giraffe, right? Everyone has this. So you're laughing because you probably got one as well. It's interesting given that the families couldn't bring very much with them. It's fascinating to see what they did choose to bring.
In our last project, we were really interested. We found people, the Chucky, the stone, and we were just laughing that these guys were left with just one bag to carry, and they brought.
And that's what they brought. I love it.
It was very funny. But no, I know I do interact with a lot of young Gujaratis, and their perspective of Gujarati heritage is Navratri and Diwali, and that's it, and apart from that, they're not really interested. It is a little bit of a shame, but maybe you in your position can bring those Gujaratis
Well, saying that, I mean, actually, a lot of them are involved in lots of dance.
Yes.
I mean, when I was growing up, you know, Gothic classes and stuff like that, there were loads of people doing that. So I suppose it's what kind of heritage you're particularly interested in. Dance seems to be very popular. Music seems to be very popular. I think it's more about the collections and the objects, which are currently less popular. But, you know, hey, maybe the museums are at fault at least partly for that. Maybe historically we haven't reached out as much as we could. You know, a lot of people, unfortunately, they reach out to what they call source communities in different places around the world, and unfortunately, diaspora communities have been sort of left out of that a fair bit. So I'm hoping that, you know, because we are trying to do a lot more work engaging these communities, and I also mentioned that, you know, a collecting project is part of the display project that I'm currently working on. Maybe it's another way to start thinking carefully about, well, how do objects represent us? What do we want to represent us? And if one incredible community like the Sikh community, the Punjabi community are doing that really well right now, hopefully other diaspora communities will look at that and go, hey, maybe that's exactly what we could be doing. We have just as rich stories, just as rich collections. Maybe it's something we could go and have a go at as well. And once you've got that dialogue happening and saying, hey, how did you guys start doing this? How does it work? You know, is it very expensive? Could you give us any help and advice? What an amazing starting point for any other community to try it.
You mentioned this giraffe. Why a giraffe?
I have no idea, but you know, my uncles all had one, we all had one.
I think it's an African connection.
It's just a connection,
kind of
yeah.
a memory moment or kind of thing.
I remember my dad, he always said that, you know, he never felt anything but African. He always felt very African. That's where he was born, that's where he was raised. He came over as an adult, and it was, you know, he would speak a local language as well as a bit of English and Gujarati, and you know, it was always quite important to have those, you know, mementos of his home, you know, his upbringing with him.
Do you ever consider taking your objects out into the community and do some what do you call field trips? And sometimes you know, people are reluctant to come. They may not necessarily come to the museum, but what about taking your objects out and sharing the stories of these objects to the communities?
We do that a lot, actually. They might not go to necessarily a community centre, but we share objects all around the UK, and we also have touring exhibitions all around the world. So objects are constantly travelling, and this is hundreds and hundreds of them. For the Manchester project, we'll be loaning, we don't even know how many yet, a whole load of objects from the museum that will be on display in Manchester there as well. So it is definitely something that we do, and we regularly have study days where people can come. I appreciate that, you know, they might not be able to come to London, but they can definitely visit their local museum where there's likely to be a BM object there as well.
What do you want your legacy at British Museum to be?
I would like the makeup of staff here to be genuinely representative of the wider society that we live in. If I could have one legacy, it would be just that one. We would have so many more perspectives looking at what we're doing, how we're doing it. You know, of course it has an impact on how you research collections and how you look at them and how you display them and how you work with other communities to do it. How can it not? So for me, I think if I could have one legacy, that's the one it would be.
And what would your advice be to BAME students or people who want to come into this sector?
I wrote an entire blog post about this because I get asked about it a lot. So if I could add a link to this interview, I would be very happy to do it. But, you know, start getting experience of it as soon as you can. You know, when you're a student and you have spare time, make the most of it. I had to work, I had a job while I was studying, but I also took little pockets of time where I could, just to get a little bit of experience to find out if this is actually what I really wanted to do. And it was only maybe a week or a few days at a time, but it was vital. It showed me that this is exactly what I want to do. And when you send out that email, don't just write a generic email, you know, please be specific. Don't say something like, hey, can I volunteer with you? And can I just, you know, come in and do this stuff? Well, actually not really, because it takes so much training, so much security clearance, and there is so much to do. and a lot of my own time that I dedicate to it. So please be specific, ask to meet for coffee or something, explain what you want to get out of it and how long you can realistically dedicate to it. If you can only do a week, that's fine, that's not a problem. If you want to do it for maybe a day a week for a whole year, that's also fine, fantastic. But just let curators know, because there are fewer and fewer staff, we're given more and more work to do, and frankly it's not easy to accommodate people even though we really want to. So try and make it as easy for us as you can, please. And you know what, all universities, so many universities have museums or collections or archives or societies. Make the most of those. National Museum's got a lot of volume of inquiries to be a volunteer. But your amazing university or your local society will have incredible collections, great archives, and it's a fantastic way to get some information, but also to get some really good experience. So don't overlook that.
Anything you want to add to the discussion? Anything you want to say?
Gosh. I was sort of thinking, when you asked if I would do this interview, and I thought, I wonder why they want to interview me, because what experience do I have of migration? I do a regular commute, and I don't. That migration story, I'm wondering how important that is to my actual life right now, and it's important to me emotionally, and it's important to me in the sense that I know why I'm here, and I know why my family is here. And I know the wider history of it because I'm fascinated by that. But on an everyday level, I think we're so caught up in the busyness of work and family and running around and doing everything. It's so easy to forget that incredible legacy. And I don't want to. I don't want to forget it. But I don't want it to totally define me and what I'm doing and how I'm living my life. So it's an interesting thing to mull over. And it's definitely something I've been thinking about a lot more since you asked me about this interview.
And also, do you think we often ask how did this country change the Gujarati community or Gujarati people living in this country? That's rather obvious. But the other way around, how does the Gujarati community change this society? Maybe this is a question I would like to ask you. Do you think there's an impact?
I think every diaspora community has an impact on its local society, and of course the Gujarati community has an impact on it as well. You only need to go to your local GP or your pharmacy or your corner shop or your accountant or your any other professional services, and you're very likely to find a Gujarati there, including in business as well. I think it's an incredibly driven community. We've only been here, a generation and a bit? It's not even been that long. And yet we've had a massive impact already on the society that we live in and that we are part of. I think that's incredible. I really think that's a testament to how hard everyone works, but also how hard everyone supports each other. Because it's quite easy to say, hey, I got here on my own merit and I just worked hard. And yeah, of course you did that. But you also had some serious support from your family and any family friends to get to that point. And I think it's very easy to forget that, and I don't think we should, because we've all had a hand up, we've all had that help. And I think without that kind of network that we have, through our local community groups, you all have that, I think it would have been much harder to have that kind of impact on society, but also harder to maintain the really wonderful, strong culture that we have. Like you mentioned, Navratri and Diwali and stuff like that. The lights in Belgrave Road. We all go to the the local Garba. It's brilliant. It's a wonderful way to introduce your children to it as well. And it's nice to have those kind of focuses throughout the year to feel authentically whatever you are, however you're defining yourself as a Gujarati or a British South Asian or a British Gujarati or, somebody of mixed heritage, whatever that is. It's nice to have that. It's nice to have that touch where you can get dressed, have a brilliant time with your family and your community as well. Yeah.
I suppose the British community too has learnt a lot from us as well, our family values and things like that. Don't you think?
I have never thought about it, if I'm honest. I've always thought about it the other way around, but maybe you're right. Yeah, maybe we have. had that wider impact, but also the importance of family and family support in getting to where you want to go. You know, whether it's financial, whether it's just, you know, somebody saying, no, you can do it, you can definitely do it, like my parents always did for me. You know, compared with, I think, all of my cousins, I took quite an unusual career path. But I can honestly say that it was never begrudged to me. My family always supported me in doing it. They didn't know anyone who worked in museums or in history or anything like that, but they all supported me. It wasn't always financial because they couldn't all afford to do it financially, but it was always like, no, of course you're going to do it. Yeah, of course you can do that. It was never, oh no, you can't do that. Oh my God, what are you thinking? It was like, yeah, go, give it a go, see what happens. And I think without that, I wouldn't be in this kind of job or this kind of sector. I would have gone for some other boring route, and God, it would not be feeding my soul like this job is feeding my soul, I think.